Hello everyone and welcome. So, did the Vikings use helmets? Well, of course, the answer might seem obvious. Of course they did, because protecting your head is the most important part of your body to protect, and the best way of doing it is by wearing a helmet. So of course they would wear helmets. However, there are some evidences that show that the Vikings might not have used helmets in such a large degree. For example, we have only found one complete Viking helmet, which is the Geirmundbu helmet. And one is very little compared to all the other things that we have found from the Viking Age. So some people believe that the Vikings might not actually have used helmet to such a large degree. Now, before we start talking about whether or not the Vikings did or did not use helmets, well, we should first talk about what is even a Viking, because most of people would think that a Viking, the word Viking, is used to talk about a certain culture, the Viking culture. Now that isn't actually true, because the word Viking, so the English word Viking, is an adaptation to English of the Norse word vikinger, which means originally an expedition. So for example, in Norse you could say Egil for I Viking med Thorolfi, which would mean Egil went on an expedition with Thorolf. So the word Viking was more and more used to give a name to the people who went on these expeditions, which usually were raids, and therefore the word Vikinger can actually be translated by raider or sea raider. So Vikinger or Viking is basically more a profession, as you would be a sailor, a merchant, a warrior, a farmer, whatever. It's more of a profession than a culture. Now, of course, in modern days, we use the word Viking for the culture, even though that's not historically correct. And I will be using the word Viking as the culture of Viking in this video, even though that's not historically correct, because it's just simpler to do it like this. Now we can start talking about whether or not the Vikings did use helmets. Now, we know that the Vikings used some helmets. First of all, we have found one helmet, the Geirmundbu helmet. So we know that at least one guy at one point had that helmet on and that he actually used it. We know the Vikings did use helmets. We also have quotes from written sources such as the sagas where helmets are mentioned. For example, in Grettir's saga, you have this. The berserk was sitting on his horse wearing his helmet, the chin piece of which was not fastened. Clearly a helmet is mentioned in this quote. Then we also have another one from King Haakon's saga. King Haakon, whose sharp sword dyes red, the bright steel cap on many a head. So clearly again we are mentioning a helmet and a steel helmet. So we know the Vikings did use helmets, and these are only two quotes out of a lot. There are many other ones. So we know that they did use helmets. However, helmets seems to be actually very rare. If we go back to our quotes, we have a berserker. Now, usually people would think of a berserker as a shirtless guy wearing a bear skin. That is not the actual truth. In reality, berserkers are basically just elite warriors and are the most likely ones to wear armor and helmets. So we have a berserker wearing a helmet, and then on the next quote we have a king wearing a helmet. And throughout all the quotes we have either berserkers, kings, but also elite warriors, rich farmers, Vangen guards. For example, in Laxdela saga, Bolli Bollason, a Vangen guard is mentioned having a gilt helmet, so basically a golden helmet. So basically, all throughout all these quotes, all of which I have been able to find, always the helmets are used by very important persons that are very rich and that can afford such expensive things as helmets. And of course, well, the ones who had so much money were not the majority of the population, and most people were therefore probably not wearing helmets. Now, some people believe that the Vikings would use leather helmets. And that kind of makes sense, because a leather helmet will protect you a lot from minor hits, so just a small sword slash or anything like that. It will clearly not protect as much as a steel helmet, but will still offer some protection. And it also explains why we haven't found any of these helmets, because it's leather, it has a lot of chance of rotting away. So I tried to search to see whether I could find any evidence for leather helmets, and I could not. Basically, I found absolutely no evidence at all for leather helmets in any written sources, in any visual source, nothing. And, well, of course, it might have happened that one or two so-called Vikings used leather helmets, but that was definitely not what was common, and therefore we cannot really say that the Vikings did use leather helmets at all. Now you may ask, well, why were these helmets so rare? So the main reason is just simply the price of the helmet, because a helmet is very expensive. Not as expensive as something like a male shirt, but it still is very expensive. Not only that, but you also need a lot of skill to actually make a metal helmet. If you take something like a male shirt, yes, it's very hard to make, but if you just learn the quick basic movements of how you assemble the rings together, you can actually have one or two inexperienced people actually just sitting there assembling mail and not needing that amount of skill. When making a helmet, you need way more skill. You need a forge to be able to bend the plates. You need rivets to be able to attach everything together. And of course, everything needs to fit together and, well, have the right shape of the head, have the right dimensions, everything like that. It's very complicated to make a helmet. And this means that helmets are not only more expensive, but they're also much rarer because fewer people start making them. Now, in terms of the research I did, I found out that probably approximately around 1 to 2% of Viking warriors or any so-called Vikings that would be in an army actually had helmets. Only 1 to 2%. Now, of course, there is a caveat to this, and that is that all the battles that so-called Vikings have fought, they have fought outside of Scandinavia. And the research I did and the research other people have done, only take into account the helmets that have been found in Scandinavia. And of course, if I wear this helmet and die on the battlefield in, I don't know, England, for example, well, the helmet is later going to be found in England, and therefore everyone's going to believe that, well, it's an English helmet and not a Viking helmet. So we could say that maybe helmets were just a little bit more common because they were usually lost in other places than Scandinavia. So we could say maybe it went up to 2 to 4% even of the Vikings who used helmets, but we cannot be sure of this, and all the evidence proves that it wasn't much more than 1 to 2%. Now you may ask the question, well, what kinds of helmets did the Vikings use? So of course we have the classic kind of Viking helmet with goggles, Spangenhelmen type of helmet, and this was the most common style of helmet. Now I would say that approximately 50% of so-called Viking helmets were of this classic Viking shape, and the other 50% were actually imported because Scandinavia has always lacked a lot of iron. There isn't a lot of iron in Scandinavia at all. Therefore, making things like this in iron or steel in Scandinavia is very hard because you don't have the raw materials you need. Therefore, a lot of helmets, but also armor and swords or weapons were imported from other places, and therefore up to 50% of Viking helmets were actually imported. And 25% were probably imported from what's today England and what's today the UK. So they were basically more of the Anglo-Saxon kind of helmet, so more likely to have chin guards and more likely to have a nose guard instead of goggles, and so on. Then we also have 25% of helmets which probably were of Slavic origins. So basically what's today Russia, Poland, and stuff like that. So basically 25% of helmets would be more of this style here. So more Slavic kind with a nose guard instead of goggles usually, and just more Slavic design in general. Of course, this wasn't the majority of helmets. The majority of helmets had this goggle shape and stuff like that. But helmets like this did exist, and Anglo-Saxon kind of helmets did also exist and were very common. So basically, in the end, yes, the Vikings did use helmets. They did use metal helmets. No evidence of leather helmets. But metal helmets, were very rare and only used by a group of elite that were very focused on fighting and that actually had a lot of armor. As for the kind of helmet that was used, it was mostly the kind of classic Viking helmet with goggles and stuff like that. But they also used a lot of Anglo-Saxon kind of helmets, and this Slavic kind of helmet were also very common. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.